Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week I've got Trevin Stratton, the chief economist for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, on FaceTime because we are physical distancing. And hi Trevin.
Hi Dale, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
Yeah, I'm alright.
All right, so I had one particular question for you this week, which is that the governor of the Bank of Canada, Stephen Poloz, said this week that we shouldn't think of the current economic situation like a recession or another depression, because a recession is at its core behavioral, and this is an external shock, more akin to a natural disaster. And that kind of got me thinking that it might help for people to kind of reframe the way in which we're thinking about the economic situation we're in. And so I thought I'd ask you about that.
Yeah, so most economic crises, result because of some initial shock. But that could be a number of different things. And I think the point that Governor Poloz is making is that this is very different than what we're used to when it comes to economic crises, which is a financial crisis causing a larger economic crisis that reverberates throughout the real economy.
Okay.
If we're thinking about 2008, if we're thinking about 1929, certainly something that started the broader economic crisis was a problem in financial markets. These can be asset bubbles, these can be government debt crises, these can be currency crises. They can be a number of different things, these speak to underlying fault lines in the economy based on mispricing and asset allocation and things like that. What we're dealing with here, is not necessarily due to any underlying fault lines in the economy. There certainly are some aspects of our economy that can be improved. It's because of this external shock that happens to be a health pandemic. And we've seen this before. It can be natural disasters. It can be things like 9/11 in the early 2000s that results in a broader economic decline. And so it's somewhat different in that way. But when it comes to the anatomy of a broader economic crisis, usually there's a shock, and the real question is how do we either mitigate the impacts on the broader economy, or how do we recover as quickly as possible after that shock?
Okay. So with that in mind, I guess, are there any ways in which we need to think about the current situation differently than just the typical kind of Keynesian notion of, well, if government applies stimulus, that will solve things? Because it's not really something that we can stimulate our way out of right now. It's a very different kind of a situation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because even though this might be fundamentally different than, for instance, a financial crisis causing an economic downturn, it still has similar effects on the economy. So even though we have this external shock, whether it's financial or not, whether it's a health pandemic, that it still has an impact, for instance, on aggregate demand, right? Because there are less people working. They might have smaller incomes, or they might have none at all, and so they're consuming less. There are businesses that might have less activity, that are buying less. It also impacts supplies, and so in a way it can result in a supply shock, because it's disrupting supply chains both globally and also within Canada too, and kind of deteriorating some of those efficiencies that we've created through economic connectivity over the past few decades.
Right.
And so the question is really, once we are able to hopefully get the health aspects of the crisis under control, what do we do to help ensure that the economic impact doesn't last much longer than the actual health pandemic itself?
Right. And I mean, on the one hand, one kind of assumes that once the lockdowns are lifted and people can start going back to work, that, people will be rehired at their jobs and so on. But I guess there'd be the lingering psychological effects of, do people want to actually go to a restaurant where there are other people around, or are we going to be kind of in this kind of state of shock and not want to do some of the same kinds of things that we used to.
Right, that's a really good point. I mean, the economy is not a light switch, and even though we were able to, for instance, ramp down some economic activity rather quickly, ramping back up will probably take a significant amount of time. Some things that the government has done in terms of the measures that they've put in place will help with that. For instance, the wage subsidy and maintaining those relationships between employers and employees will hopefully help with getting people back to work as quickly as possible. But then there are certainly some aspects that we're not going to be able to resolve as quickly as possible, and we're going to have to look at potentially things like stimulus, but also I'm not sure if going back to the status quo ante before the crisis is necessarily the best way to think about it as well. I mean, we're going to exit the health aspects of this crisis with quite a bit of debt, huge deficits, which are certainly needed, and counter-cyclical spending has certainly been very useful in hopefully mitigating the negative impact of the crisis. But then going forward, I mean, how do we actually ensure that our economy is able to recover quickly? Things like austerity would create a lot of hardship for individuals and businesses. Things like inflation that can help with huge debt levels, obviously, because if the value of your debt is less than your debt itself, is at least in real terms, not as huge as it was, if inflation wasn't as high.
Right.
But we've seen that create huge problems, for instance, in the 1980s in Canada and elsewhere. And so growth is going to be incredibly important for our economy to get out of this and to help reduce all the spending that we've been doing too. And so we need to make sure that we have the policies in place that encourage growth, that encourage investment, that encourage a competitive investment environment in Canada too. And so, these things are going to be very important when we're thinking forward about recovery too.
Right. And I guess the last thing I would just basically ask is, we're seeing a lot of people who had a pre-existing policy solution in mind, and suddenly they see the current situation as being the perfect reason for why we needed to implement their solution in the first place. As someone who deals with a lot of these proposals as part of your job, I guess how does that aspect kind of look forward for you in the weeks ahead?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to say that businesses, governments, labor, nonprofits, they've done a very good job of putting what is important and making that a priority in the middle of this crisis. But you're right, looking ahead, there are different stakeholders that also see crises as opportunities to push their agenda forward. And that's a very important point. And we're going to need to keep this in mind going forward as well, to ensure that no matter what type of organization we're talking about, that they're not trying to, for instance, encroach upon what is needed for our economy to actually recover. And you're right, I'm certainly keeping this in the back of my mind too. I have heard about proposals, for instance, for industrial strategies and things of the like. And these are going to be coming out of the woodwork as well, and we're going to need to be thinking about how this pandemic has actually restructured our economy and what's actually needed, coming out of it to remain competitive in the global economy as well.
Right, because globalism won't go away just because this is knocked a little bit of wind out of its sails.
Yeah, I mean, globalism might in itself change. I mean, globalization is not always the same as what we have been used to for the past few years. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we'll need to make sure that the Canadian economy remains competitive globally as well. But certainly some aspects will be impacted, whether they are supply chains, whether there is a move towards reshoring, we'll see. But I mean, at least looking forward, we certainly need to keep our economy front and center after the health aspects are under control, hopefully.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this.
Thanks, Dale.
All right. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.